Hi, everyone, and welcome to It's Getting Hot in Here, making documentation sexy. And I feel like, Julz, I feel like I should slip into like a low tone there when we're talking about making documentation sexy. But,
yeah, we can try.
But we're coming in late in the conference, so we're going to try to keep the energy high on something that most people might consider slightly less energetic in terms of topic, but I'll hand it over to Julz in a second. But my name is Veronica. I am the consulting director at Blueprint X in ANZ, and I'm the one coming at you with the Australian accent. But I will hand over to our Texas Brit.
Just to confuse everyone even more, so I'm Julz James, Senior Marketing Operations Manager at Sixth Sense, from the UK, but living in Texas, I always like throwing people off with that accent. So again, thank you and welcome to our session about making documentation sexy. We know it can be quite a dry subject. Hopefully we're going to give you some real good ideas of what we can do with documentation, making it interesting. So as always with documentation, there's a lot to go over. Just a couple of things to kind of talk about with our intro is we talk about documentation all the time. As most people, we work hard to try and get some documentation written. It's probably one of the hardest things in our roles that we can do because we most of the time don't have the time to do it. We're so busy fighting fires and troubleshooting that we know we have to get to it at some point. And even when we do write it, is actually read by anyone. If it's not read by anyone, what was the point of doing it in the first place? So we're going to go through just a couple of hints and tips of how to make some documentation really interesting. So kind of what, why's, how's, and where's we can start to host it. And hopefully you'll take away some really good ideas of how you can make your documentation more interesting and actually think about making it so that someone does want to read it.
I've just thought of a subtitle for this session, Julz. I think it should be called, If a 70-page Manual Falls in a Forest, Does Anybody Hear?
Does anyone hear scream? So the agenda, as I mentioned, what we're going to cover off today is kind of 5 main areas of focus. The first 3 that we're going to go through fairly quickly, the why documentation, what really is documentation, and the who, are just kind of some background as to why documentation can be important. Where we're going to spend most of our time is the how to make it sexy. We've got a number of different ways in which we can make it interesting, make it more interactive, make it more visual, and believe it or not, make it fun as well. And then last but not least, we'll finish up with where we can start to host that documentation. We know there are 1,000,001 different places where we think documentation can go. And we're just going to give a couple of examples. Some amazing people in the community gave me some examples of where they've hosted their different types of documentation. So we're going to show those as well. So the first bit, the why. I mean, we all talk about why should we do documentation. One of the reasons why we do documentation could just be that we always want to prove kind of how good technical writers we are, but we're not all technical writers. And sometimes the why is just someone said we have to do it. So why do we do documentation? There are many, many reasons why we need to do documentation. The first most important reason is to be able to communicate out with our target audience. We know that we have a lot of information and we know that we work on a lot of different things. We work on different programs, campaigns, smart lists, segmentations, velocity scripting, JavaScript, APIs, lots of different things. And not everyone understands what it is that we do. If someone asks us, why does it take us an hour to build a program? If we don't have it documented down, it can be very difficult to kind of have that conversation about, well, I can't turn this whole webinar program build around in 20 minutes because it takes this time. We have all of these different steps that we have to go through. So we can use it to help communicate our processes, our SLAs, and everything involved in what we do in marketing operations. The other reason why we do documentation is to help to teach. With new people coming into the organization, we like to have some documentation to be able to show them the ways in which we run programs or processes within our organization. As I mentioned earlier, everyone does things differently. So we want to be able to teach and provide that information. Now, we may be having one-on-one sessions, we may be having interactive sessions, training sessions, but also if we have it documented down, the way in which people learn is different. So having a one-to-one, they also have a written documentation to help them through any of those processes or projects that they're starting to build. The next reason is our collaboration. We want to make sure that we are collaborating as a team. The way in which we do things could be different. The way in which I do something is very, very different to the way in which V may do something, for example. We may build programs differently. We may build smart lists differently. We may use filters in a different way. We may understand different ways to do velocity scripting. So if we use collaboration when we're starting to build our documentation, it actually helps people in the organization to look at what our best practices are internally. And then also we know there's a million and one ways to do things. So if we have the collaboration, we can look for the best, most efficient and effective way for our organization to undertake any of these processes and practices. And the next reason is to make sure that we can help people. Again, like we can teach, we can kind of talk to people about how they can do things. But as I've already mentioned, with communication and teaching and collaboration, really as most people, the one thing we want to be able to do is to be able to help. We want to be able to help look at more efficient processes and practices. And if we have the documentation written down or kind of recorded somewhere, we're able to figure out how we can help people through the next steps if they're stuck on a particular process, they're not understanding why something's running a certain way. It could be the sales team coming to you and saying, well, why is this record MQL'd, or why are we lead scrolling it this way, or what does this thing mean in Salesforce? We're able to provide that documentation to help. And the last but not least of kind of the good reasons why we do documentation is to avoid kind of confusion. The biggest thing we see, again, there is so much happening in the marketing operations field. There is so much happening in every organization that it can get very confusing. All of the different SLAs, all of the different processes, procedures, efficiencies, practices that we have in place. It can get very, very confusing for anyone, even people who've been in the industry for a very long time can still get confused with some of those practices. So having it documented down again for your organization to look at what your best practices within your organization can hopefully help clean up any of those questions before someone reading the documentation needs to come to you and kind of ask for some additional help.
It's interesting because a colleague of mine once said to me that one of the biggest challenges marketing operations people have is that we kind of expect people to just know what it is that we're thinking. and you can't actually expect others to understand your point of view unless you communicate it properly and really give them the path and the whole point about documentation in terms of there being two sides to communication, the person who's communicating, the person who's receiving, and trying to make sure that that recipient receives it is so important.
Exactly. And not everyone knows what's happening in our brains. We like to think that everyone knows how we think. I don't think anyone knows what's going on this little head of mine, but we like to think that it is. So if we can actually try and get it out of these brains and onto paper, it definitely helps with that two-way conversation as well. Awesome. That's a really good point, Lee. Thank you. And then there's a couple of kind of, I'm going to call them bad reasons as to why we do documentations, or are they reasons that have come up because something has happened? So it's actually really is a good reason. This will make sense. This will all become clear very shortly. The first one is someone told you that it was important. Now we know documentation is important. We all understand the importance of it. I'm sure we get all asked a lot of times from our senior management team or our leaders or the chief executives of the organization of like, where's this written down, or how can I find this information? Now, again, is it a bad reason because you've been told it's important because something's gone wrong? Or is it a good reason because someone actually really wants to see and is interested in what you're doing? So just because we get told it's important, we're going to go into prioritization later on in this presentation, but it's not always important depending on the priority of the documentation that we have. The next thing we have to think about is what if I'm leaving my role? It happens. We know what's happening in the marketplace today. We know that there's some lots of shifting, lots of moving in the marketplace. So if we are leaving our role, we want to be able to have some documentation to hand over, so that we know that so that we know when we go into our next role, or when someone comes into our previous role, that hopefully they can carry on the great work that you were doing in your organization.
Just putting it out there, if you are leaving it to the end, just before you're about to leave, before documenting anything, it's almost too late. Yeah. Like you have to kind of think about the next person who's coming in and be a little bit altruistic there, because quite frankly, in our community, you might know them.
Yeah.
They might know you.
Yeah. Documentation and doing as you go is such a beneficial kind of way to look at it, because if you leave it to the end, how long does it take to write for anyone to write documentation? It can take weeks sometimes. And if you only have a 2-week notice period, you're only probably going to get 1 or 2 pieces of documentation done. Another reason why, again, maybe a bad reason that we're doing documentation, is to try and stop people making mistakes. In the long run, having documentation should hopefully help stop people making mistakes. So how is it that we build our programs out? What do these tokens mean? What are all of the different assets and landing pages and emails we need within our program? So that people can kind of get into the habit of what does that process look like to avoid those mistakes happening. It could be something simple as what does your QA process look like? We've all made mistakes. I'm sure there's going to be sessions that talk about mistakes that have happened. We've all done it. And if we have documentation that says this is the QA process that has to be done, it can help to avoid those mistakes from happening. And then last but not least, I'm sure we all get asked the same things over and over and over again. So having it documented down is a really good way of kind of not being as tired of asking telling the same thing over and over again. Think of it like an FAQ section, a frequently asked question. If you're being asked the same thing and you've been asked it 3, 4, 5 times, maybe that's the point in which you should document down the question that you're being asked on a regular basis. Now, it could just be, if it's a quick answer, you could just create an FAQ section on your internal sites or your internal servers. If it's something that is more in depth, then maybe you should look at doing some lengthier, interesting, innovative documentation. But that's really kind of the whys from the documentation. I'm now going to pass it over to the what, to have V talk about what's the point of documentation.
So the key thing, and I'm not going to spend too much time here because Julz has kind of covered it quite well. You need to help someone understand. So at the end of the day, whether it's to provide those guardrails to stop someone making a mistake, whether it is to highlight something that's really important, the purpose of the documentation is different from the why do it. It's what is the actual point of that piece of communication? And I think that distinction is actually really important. There is no point to communication without figuring out the exact thing that you want someone to get out of the back of that piece of communication. It's not just about dumping everything that you know on a document or a Trello board or whatever, or a wiki or whatever tool it is. You need to explain why these procedures are important. If they're not carried out in a correct way, all kinds of funky stuff could happen. You need to make sure that those guardrails are not only about stopping someone from making a mistake, that they're proactively pushing them towards good behavior. So it's not only the MOPS team that could be in the system. You could have staff being onboarded. You could have executive managers running reports. You could have field marketing managers. They're only running campaigns every now and then. The whole point here is whatever the purpose of the person coming into the system, whatever they need to achieve, our documentation is there to try to help them to achieve it. And the reason why I'm making that point so strongly is that you might need to write the same piece of documentation in multiple ways. What's the point? What is your actual point that you're trying to make? So I'm leaning back on my technical communication background here. Julz says not everybody has been technical writers. I spent my first 10 years of career as a technical writer, and we all come to this MOPS thing differently, right? We all have different backgrounds. But when we're doing documentation, there's just a few things about technical communication, but it has one goal. You want to get someone to understand something. So what do you want them to do? It's not just about the system works in this way, and it's like, avoid flubby stuff. Like the system works in this way, and if you do this and this, it's going to do this. No. What do you want someone to do? What's the action you want someone to take? Who's reading that information? Why should they care? It's amazing how many pieces of documentation that I read that are just like, to do this, you need to do this and this and this. It's like, I don't care. What's the context to that? Okay, in order to accomplish X, I need you to do X, Y, and Z, and that's going to get you this outcome, and this is why it's important. How is it best to communicate that information? You need to structure that out. And repetition is good. Like some people are like, oh, I need to write my documentation in lots of different funky ways because I don't want people to get bored. No, what you want is repetition. You want to make it structured and people go, okay, cool, this is the structure I'm following. I do this, and I do this, and I do this, and I do this. So it's all about making sure that that structure makes sense to the reader, and it really resonates with them as to why they should do things the way you want them to do it.
So thanks for that, V. So that was kind of looking at kind of what is the actual point of the documentation. Now we're moving on to the who. So we know that we're writing documentation for many different people, but really, unless we understand who we are actually talking to, do we even think they're actually going to listen? I know when I talk to anyone outside of the MOPS world, who they ask what I do, and I start talking about all the different things that I do in kind of different marketing automation platforms, I'm sure this is what they see, because they have no idea what I'm talking about. I'm speaking a different language to them, not just the different the different accents that we have, but it's a whole set of jargon. So when we're thinking about who is our audience, the one thing we really have to think about is, what do you think they actually want to know? Thinking about the audience who are our users, they actually want to know some technical, tactical information. How do I build this? How do I clone that? How do I create this smart campaign? Or how do I build this flow? Or how do I set up this thing in Salesforce? They really want to know kind of the nitty gritty and the how-tos. Then you have your directors and aboves. Directors, C-suites do not want to know the nitty gritty of what's happening in your marketing automation platform. What they really want to know is, what's the strategic level thinking? How is this going to help our organization grow? And what is it that you're doing kind of on the ground floor that's going to make a difference for us? Then you have your marketing managers who are outside of marketing operations. Again, they won't want to know the tactical side of how to build something, but they want to understand the process. Why does it take you 3 days to build this? Why is the turnaround time for a list upload 24 hours? Why can't you build me a webinar program in 20 minutes? If they understand what the process is, they'll start to understand why things can take certain amounts of time, or how things get built in a certain way, or why does the Zoom connection take 5 minutes to populate the link? If they start to understand that process, they'll start to understand the reasons why we're doing certain things in marketing operations. And then another group of audiences that we want to create documentation for would be for our sales teams. Now, one of the biggest things we talk about sales and marketing alignment and that handoff process. If you're in a sales team, I'm sure you would like to understand why we're handing you these sets of leads. What makes them a qualified record? Why should the sales teams be following up? They don't necessarily care about what the process is. They don't really care about maybe what the tactics are and how the build was done. What they want to know is, why is this record valid for me, and why should I start to follow up with them? So every single audience that you are writing, building, creating documentation for will have a different tone of voice. They'll have a different understanding. And if you don't kind of think about that when you're starting to create that documentation, very, very quickly you're going to lose one of those audiences that don't kind of think or understand in the same way that we do. And then we have to think about, when we think about the who, that also helps us think about what is it they actually need to know. So we talk about what is vital, but also what is it that's actually really important for them. So what's vital as users, as I mentioned, the buildings and the how-tos. But maybe some good information for the users to understand is how are operational builds already created. They may not be admins of the system. They may just be coming in and building on a regular basis, but they may just want to have an understanding of what operational programs you have running. Director and above level would really want to know reporting. They want to know attribution. They want to know multi-touch. They want to know influence over opportunities being created. They need to know that. They're going to want to know on a daily, regular basis. High level, they may want to know some of those high level processes to get an understanding of why and how we got to these figures. Vital for marketing managers would be those campaign requests and processes and SLAs. As I mentioned, they want to know why it's going to take 3 days to build this, or 4 days, or 2 weeks, or whatever your SLA is. But they good to know for the marketing managers would also be some reporting. It may not be vital for their day-to-day work, but having some understanding of how our reports are built and what do they mean is kind of a good to know for the marketing managers. And then, as I also just mentioned, with the sales teams, we're looking at what's that handoff look like. So if they are really care about, why is this lead good for me? Why should I follow up on this record? The most important information they need to know is, what are your definitions of a marketing qualified lead or a qualified account? What does the scoring look like? How do we understand what intent looks like? And then they're good to know is, are there any follow-up processes that we as the MOPS teams can start to help hopefully suggest ideas and solutions for them to follow up in their sales processes as well. So as you can see, lots of different ways and lots of different audiences, lots of different tones of voice as to why and how and who documentation is relevant for. And now actually we're going to move on to the best part of the presentation, which is focusing on the how. How can we actually make documentation interesting? How can we make it sexy? And how can we make it different? So for this,
here we go. This is the good stuff.
It is. V is going to kick it off.
Let's do it. All right. You are the sexy unicorns. I would just like to say, all of you out there who are doing MOPS today, you are the sexy unicorns, and you're the ones who are going to dive in and do some of these sexy things that we've come up with. So these are sort of a bit of a reflection of what Julz and I have sort of done as part of our careers going forward. But I am going to start again with my technical writer hat on. So this is a bit of a kind of a facetious example, I guess, on the slide, but I need to put something on the slide. But the point that I want to make here is this whole concept around active voice. Now, making it clear what we need you to do, and active versus passive voice is something that that you've gotten drilled into you since school, right? So active voice good, passive voice bad. Not actually true. What active voice does is it makes people know that you have an opinion about something, and it gives clarity to what you actually want to achieve. What passive voice tends to do is just kind of give a bunch of information that makes it sound like you don't really care one way or the other which way they go. And as we know, by everything we've already said, what we want is to make it very, very clear about what you actually want someone to do. Active voice gives you the shortest path. And by active, it means chucking words at the front. And this stuff is not just for word nerds like me, right? So it's like, it's for everybody. It's for figuring out what your really active words are. Click, select, choose, clone, block, update, like any of those kind of active verbs that you can stick at the front of sentences. Make it symmetrical. Start as many of sentences as you can with those active words, so that it will shorten everything that you do, I promise. But it will also give someone upfront that clue as to, this is the actual physical action I want to take. It's important. It's actually really important for you to put floodlights from the outset on the action you want someone to take. And this is what active voice does. So if you do nothing else in terms of technical writing, have a bit of a read around concepts around active voice. There's a lot of things online around this that you can dive into, but it's a very easy concept to get your head around, but strangely enough, not really something that people focus on. But it will overnight improve the quality of your technical writing. A couple more of my top of the line technical writing tips. Unsure about your grammar. Not everybody is a grammar nerd. You don't have to be. So if you haven't seen Grammarly at grammarly.com, this is awesome. So it's a tool that you can use inside Word, inside email, inside a lot of different platforms that you use to hammer out a lot of words. And it will give you that active voice, and it will make some suggestions about how you could switch around what it is that you're writing. Avoid slang and swear words. Sorry guys, this actually includes emojis. Like, sorry for anyone who loves to stick a bunch of emojis in your, they clutter. Use inclusive language and pronouns. Sorry, this actually really does matter. If you spend your entire document talking about he or she, you're going to alienate half of your audience. Make sure that you're being a little bit more inclusive in that language. Read examples of other people's documentation. If you were writing a novel, you would read books. If you were making films, you would watch films. If you're writing documentation, practice, practice, practice. Read examples of other people's good documentation. If you don't know the expression beta reader, then obviously you haven't spent as much time writing fan fiction as I have. But the term beta reader is all about getting someone who is your intended audience to read your documentation. It is no good asking a fellow marketing operations person to test run your documentation if they're not the intended audience. What you want to do is find a friendly salesperson or a friendly marketing person or someone who is that intended audience to give your documentation a bit of a beta read so that they can give you really honest feedback about how it's coming across. Give people methods to give you feedback. That's going to help you make it sexy. Just you need to be open to feedback. And this leads very nicely into the next section, which Julz is going to take over. Don't be afraid to bribe people. Don't be afraid to offer incentives for participation. So this is about really moving into this engagement and adoption of your documentation that we need to go into.
Yeah, which perfect segue, thanks Fee, is talking about making it fun. So again, we know documentation can be a dry topic. This is just an example of actually something we're doing internally here at Sixth Sense right now, is actually trying to make it fun and interesting. There's some incentivization around creating some documentation. We have the hashtag of documentation is dope. We have a Slack channel where all the documentation is being written. We have different types of documentation that's being written, and it's not just PowerPoint presentations and kind of Word documents. There's videos in there. There's different screenshots. There's different how-to sections. There's different types of documentation that we're creating. So really thinking about how you can make creating the documentation fun. So the incentivization could be to get someone to help you read it, but also actually incentivizing people to write documentation. Again, we all know how long it is, how hard it is to be able to write that documentation, how long that it takes. So if we can provide some incentives around it, this is actually something for our whole go-to-market team that is working on. So it's not just the marketing operations team, it's the CS operations team, it's the RevOps team, it's anyone who's involved in go-to-market operations in the organization to create documentation, because we all know everything's happening. There's a million people doing a million different things. So if we can have some ways of incentivizing to create that documentation on our weekly calls, we have like a little leaderboard to look at who's been creating documentation, how it's been created. And at the end of each quarter, there is some calculations, tabulations, not just of how much documentation is written, but also the quality of that documentation as well. So it's actually really interesting to see when people start to really get into the swing of creating documents. And you can see where people have kind of maybe a spare hour or two, because suddenly you'll start to see bits of documentation popping up all over the place. But make it fun, make it interesting, and if you're able to incentivize it to make it even more fun, that's also a good way to do it as well.
If anyone's ever heard of like white hats, like this idea of like hackers who are out there like hacking for good, do the same thing in your documentation. If somebody incentivize someone to tell you if something's wrong. So if they find a bug, or if they find something that's wrong, or if they find something that could be improved, I actually sort of chuck the incentivization in that as well. But so make it obvious. So this is about pushing stuff into people's faces. And again, it's not only about how you read the documentation, it's how you get it to people. So instead of just giving someone a big wiki, and I mentioned the whole 70-page manual before, so I'm all about short, sharp pieces of communication, Slack alerts, microblogging. Julz mentioned FAQs normally. Don't just stick an FAQ page up and expect people to go to it. Be constantly sending people the regular updates about that FAQ being updated. Now's the time to use your skills as marketers. Okay, so one of the things that marketing operations people often forget is that we are also part of the marketing team, usually. Sometimes we're part of RevOps, and sometimes we're part of IT, whatever. Usually we have some kind of marketing nuance to our backgrounds. Use that. Enroll people in an internal nurture series. I'm not one of those people who thinks that Marketo, it cannot be used for internal communication. Prove me wrong, happy to have that argument in the chat. But the enroll people in nurture series, onboarding, drip feed them information exactly like you would when onboarding a customer. And marketing automation platform alerts when things occur. Don't just tell them what's happened, tell them how to respond to it. The number of times that I've seen people send alerts from something like Marketo to salespeople, and all it has is, you've got a lead, here's the information. This is your perfect opportunity with this captive audience to tell them what to do. And repetition, again, it doesn't matter how many times you tell someone something to someone. Once they know it, they'll just gloss over it. They won't care. But if someone's forgotten what they're supposed to do, click on this link, go in here, change the status, update this. Like, make sure people know what you want them to do every time you have them as a captive audience.
Yeah, and just one thing to kind of add on to that as well. When we talk about kind of repetition, the one thing we always say a lot of times is like, tell them what you're going to tell them and tell them what you've told them. Because if you keep doing that and you're kind of my whole, like someone hitting the head and being asked the same thing over and over again, that will start to decrease. Like the more that we can tell people and repeat what it is that we do, what the process is, why this SLA is that in that way, and we have it written down, we can tell people through Slack, we can tell people face to face. Like the more we do that, hopefully the less people will come to us with the same questions over and over again, and then things will just start to fall into place.
To be fair, we are not actually advocating you hitting someone over the head with something.
No.
But if it works.
Hey, when we're back in person, maybe. And so the other thing you're going to start to see from us these next couple of slides is trying to, again, make sure someone is able to see it on a regular basis. So whether it's visual, we know that we have visual learners. We know that there are learners that like to read. We know there's audio learners. These are just a couple of clips of some actual documentation videos that I've done of like how to clone an email program, how to update and edit Salesforce campaigns. So we know that not everyone wants to read a document about this. If I'd have written a document about how to update, there was 3 particular fields to update on this Salesforce campaign. That may have been 2-3 page documentation of how to do it. I did it in about a 2-minute video. One was cloning how to clone a particular campaign within Marketo. Again, writing it out, putting screenshots in there is really helpful, but 1 or 2 pages later, when I can do a 40-second video of how to clone this particular program. So when we're talking about documentation, we're not talking about just written War and Peace, 300-page documents and center of excellences. We're talking about all the different ways to make it interesting, to make it sink into someone's brain as well.
What's your favorite video tool for making these short form videos?
I use one called Awesome Screenshot. It's a little Chrome plugin, and you can do videos, you can edit within Chrome, you can do audio or no audio, you can do annotations while you're going as well, and it's a free little Chrome plugin. So
I use Loom a lot as well. So
yes.
Yeah, find out what people's favorite, or pick a favorite of these, and just make sure that you can do it really quickly. And don't worry if you flub little bits of it. Like, nobody's going to care. You don't have to redo the video over and over and over again. Just get it done. Yeah,
exactly. And if you're thinking about it, if you've been asked that question 5 times, you're like, I'm just going to do a quick video. 2 minutes later,
while you're thinking about it. Yes,
exactly. So much easier. Cool. And then back to V.
All right, make it hard to miss. So this is actually one of my favorite, but undervalued kind of tools. If you are a Marketo user, this description field, it's blank a lot. It just is, and a lot of us don't use it for many things. But if you have a project briefing process, or if you have documentation that's specifically relevant, this is really, really good for those always on campaigns, those operational and administrative type campaigns that don't change a lot. So this whole idea of when it was last updated, who it was updated by, and a link out to your documentation or your project brief that describes what this particular thing does. Just doing that is an amazing reference, and it makes Marketo sort of a more self-documenting system. So if you haven't been doing this, I highly recommend it. I can't remember who it was who taught me how to do this the first time, but whoever you are, you have changed my life. I love this one. So, all right, for the people in the audience who have budget, I realize we've been talking about low budget or no budget kind of things that you can do up till now. There are some of you out there who actually have budget to throw at these things, and who have adoption targets and things like that around documentation. So digital process automation tools. So we're talking things like WalkMe, we're talking improved apps, we're talking a bunch of different tools that you can actually use inside your system. So this is obviously sitting inside Salesforce, and a non-lightning version at that. But you can see here, there's this little tool that's popping out, and it's telling them what's contextually relevant for them on this screen. They're popping over that new button. It says click new, and the next step is going to tell them the next thing that they need to click. This is for people who are serious adoption managers within your practices, right? So so these little pop-outs, you can get rid of them really easily as part of your personal settings inside these tools. You can stop them from popping up so much if you're a power user, but you can have them pop up if you're a little less sure of what you're doing. But it is amazing how much difference having contextual help, that's the term that technical writers use for this. So when you're inside your software, what this actually means is that people can engage and inform themselves as they need to, and going through the operational piece. And this one is awesome because this one's activated by clicking on the little help icons right next to it. So it's an internal tool that is installed into your app, and basically it's kind of browser based. But if you click on the little icons next to it, it will pop up a little video that tells you exactly what you need to do for that field and how that field feeds into an existing process. So again, these tools do have some cost around them, and do require just a little bit of budget to make it all happen. And obviously take a little bit more effort up front. But if you have big, important processes that people must follow, so we're talking sales processes, we're talking billing processes, we're talking internal campaign processes that impact your entire kind of attribution model. If we need to document those out, it's worth it. I hope everybody likes my little dancing bot. So this little blue guy is called the DocuBot. And I wanted to tell you a bit of a story about something that I did to manage a GDPR and privacy compliance. So I was working for a large organization that had marketers in 20 countries. And what we were finding was really difficult was getting people to put it was so small, but really important. When people are building landing pages for capturing people's information, the privacy policy on that landing page would differ depending on the type of lead or the type of information that's being captured. So what we were trying to do was make something that really kind of allowed someone to interactively find the answer based on criteria. And the best way to do that is bots. So a bot, we use chatbots out on websites, we use chatbots for lead gen. A lot of us do that all the time. What I did was build an internal thing that starts with the input. So getting the input, what the user types in a question, what privacy text do I need in this situation? So it's like, so the next question, what do you need? So we need to, once they've said the word privacy, the bot goes, cool, do you want to find a privacy statement? Yes. Okay, what country is your campaign in? It's in Germany. Okay, Germany has a double opt-in and it has a bunch of different criteria that's needed. Is this a partner event or a customer event? Partner event. Okay, so, and just leads people down the garden path until finally you get the privacy statement that you want. We had all of these documented on a single page. It's like Germany, partner, need to do this, use this privacy statement, and everybody was getting it wrong. But the second we kind of made it more interactive and started doing the DocuBot, by the way, this bot is actually really common in the legal industry because the legal industry is starting to really get on top of sort of helping people to sort of in self-guided kind of responses. But it transferred so easily over into marketing ops, and I was able to build something out that enables someone to just lead themselves through the process and get the right result. And what we found was that, compliance and getting it right sort of went up by like 40%. So it was a really interesting way, and it was worth the effort. And it really wasn't that hard because I was used to building bots, chat bots and things like that for lead gen. So I knew the concept and the process. So think about interactivity and making it a bit different, and making it something they maybe haven't seen before to help people get to the result that you want.
I would love to. I want to play with that bot one day because I think it's going to be really useful for all different types of documentation across different organizations. So then one of the last things we're going to start to look at now is basically making it a priority. I talked about this earlier on in the session, was thinking about what is a priority for when we're trying to build documentation. We know that we don't have time to write a 500-page piece of documentation or create a whole COE in the next.
Nobody will read it.
And no one is going to read it. No one's going to look at it. So really what I want to do in this is just to cover off just a couple of things that when we're thinking about documentation is really focus on what is actually a priority for your documentation. So we're thinking about kind of what are our business critical features. So things like routing and scoring are very important. UTM mapping, attribution is very, very business critical because you're going to get asked a lot of questions about it. Why is it working in this particular way? We think it's broken. Should it be doing this thing? If we have that all written down already, we know that's an important these are important sets of documentation. Things like compliance that V was just mentioning about. We know that these are business critical documents that we need to create. And again, doesn't have to be a Word document. It could be a video. It could be a bot, whatever it is. But we know we have to maybe prioritize those in our list of tasks that we have to do. Then we have our operational. Operational really started to think about kind of those how-tos and configurations, things that within the MOPS team, we know how to build things, or we know why operational programs are running in a certain way, but they would be at some point be a really good thing to start to write up. If we think that the team is going to grow, we're going to start to bring on more people, we're going to get external people into the organization. So those operational documentations are useful. And then really when we get to those nice to haves, they're the kind of administrative types of documents. So what are our user roles and permissions? What do they look like? What admin information do we have? Do we have our sets of channels or tags between our automation system and our CRM system? They're kind of those nice to have piece of documentation. But if you can really start to think about what does your entire documentation ecosystem look like, and then think about what are those business critical documents that we need to create all the way through to, at some point we're going to get to, it's a nice to have, but it's not really important for running the organization. That will help you prioritize all of the different types of documents that you may want to write after this session, hopefully. Last but not least of our kind of whirlwind tour of how to make documentation interesting, sexy, and kind of make it different is kind of, we've created all of this stuff. Now, where do we put it? So what I'm going to show you now is just a couple of examples of different types of documentation that, like I said, I reached out to the MOPS world and asked people if they wouldn't mind sharing the documentation and where they hosted it, because we know it's not just, we're not just going to build a Word document and just have it hosted. Maybe we may have a Google link and have it built in Drive. There are so many different places in which we can host our documentation that I just wanted to show you just a couple of examples of where we can find this information. So this is an example that came through from McGraw-Hill. So huge thanks to Chelsea and Carissa for providing this. They host their documentation in multiple different places. Now, if you've ever seen sessions that Chelsea and I have done together when we've talked about kind of training, she focuses a lot on interactive training, videos, how-to guides, building processes. So all of their documentation is stored internally on wikis, but they have it stored in multiple different places in multiple different forms. You can see there's simple text forms, there's graphic design forms as well, and they also have some building documentation. The other piece of documentation that was provided was from Adele at Bizarre Voice. So thank you again from Adele from Bizarre Voice to be able to provide some of this documentation. They host their documentation slightly differently. They again host it on internal servers. But again, you can see they have some written documentation. They have lots of screenshots in the documentation. What they also have in here, which obviously has been kind of hidden for particular reasons, is when the documentation was created, the goal behind the documentation, who the owner is of that documentation. So that again, if you have some questions, you can also reach out to those people that wrote that documentation as well. So again, we don't just have to write documentation and kind of host it on our own, kind of within our own systems. We don't want to keep it up here in our brains. We want to make sure that we're using wikis, Confluences, SharePoint drives, OneDrive, Google Drives, if that's what you've had, using your DocuBots and hosting it on your own within the apps, using things like Spec-It to have it within apps, have it interactive. But really do think about what type of documentation are you creating? Where is it most useful to be hosted, and actually what makes it really easy for someone to be able to dive into it. I've seen wikis that are 20 kind of levels deep, and trying to find that one piece of documentation takes 25-30 minutes. You want to make sure your documentation is hosted in a way that is easy to find, easy to understand, easy to get to, and easy to consume as well. Awesome. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Hopefully we've answered your questions as we've been able to go. Now it's time for the live Q&A. So if you have any questions, comments, please drop them in the chat box. Please let us know. And hopefully we can answer any questions, queries, burning desires that you may have. Awesome. So thank you very much. Hopefully you enjoyed that session. We had hopefully lots of hints and tips for things of how you can make documentation interesting and sexy. We are going to jump into our live Q&A now, starting with actually a really good question that came up from Albert Razzo, which was, what would you say about team members that do not make an effort to self-learn? I have knowledge acquisition and I'm giving my knowledge for free. Am I giving my knowledge for free? I work with, we have a fairly kind of large MOPS team, and we have everything from people who are very new to marketing operations, and also people who are who've been working in marketing operations for some time. I think for me, it's difficult for people to sometimes self-learn, but I always ask people to kind of go, if they have a question, I'll be like, go and see if you can find the right answer first. If not, then I'll share that information with you. I love sharing information. I love sharing my knowledge. I want everything that is up here to be given out to my team. Like, my goal is to get my team upskilled, up-leveled, so that they can basically take over from what I'm doing. That's my goal. So I don't think it's giving knowledge away from free. I think I've spent 10-ish years doing this. I love nothing more than being able to give that information. But from the kind of the teacher side of my brain is, I'm not going to give the information for free. I want you to see if you can find that answer first. That's what I always tend to do, is if you can find it, or kind of tell me why you think you need this question or why you think you need this information, then basically being able to work with that team member and get them to find out and learn that new information. Self-learning is hard. Not everyone wants to do it. And I think the more that we can provide information without just spoon-feeding someone, is a really good way for your team to be able to learn and grow.
Just where that bribery comes in.
Exactly.
We've got another question from Danielle Cox. So when the documentation needs to be shared with multiple audience types, what's the best way to organize that documentation? My favorite is role-based. So rather than starting with sort of, and I guess it's kind of a little bit counterintuitive based on what we said before about make sure that it's all about what someone needs to do. That's sort of the next level down. But one of the big things that happens is when you've got documentation that's all stored on like a wiki or a SharePoint or something like that, and people need to kind of search through to figure out what's relevant for them and their role. So what I tend to start out with is kind of and we all love a good foldering structure, right? When I'm in marketing ops, I tend to start out at the top level with kind of 4 users, 4 marketers, 4 managers, 4 sales, and start out at that level and then drill down at the next level. It's like, what are you trying to do? You're trying to do this, you're trying to do this, you're trying to do this, you're trying to do this. So role-based, then context-based, and in that kind of cascading structure is my favorite. It's only a problem when you try to just blob everything down onto kind of one page without any kind of structure to it. That's when you're going to essentially run into trouble.
Yeah. And I think that leads really nicely into the question from Jeff Bedford that says, any tips on managing documentation? What are the best practices for avoiding stale documentation, making sure folks go to the right place, preventing over documentation? I think the number one thing is, I don't think there's such a thing as over documentation. I think if you're writing it or recording it or creating it in the right way, if you have to write a piece of documentation and record a video for the same thing, I don't think that's over documentation, because as we mentioned earlier, people learn in different ways. So I don't think there is such a thing as documentation. I think the important piece is avoiding stale documentation. So having people on the team who, and Alex kind of asked a similar question, should we have someone full-time? Like having a couple of people on the team who, if you have a team, who are kind of keeping an eye on that documentation when you're making changes, making sure that you go in and update that documentation as soon as you're making like a program template change or an SLA change or a process change, that will help avoid that stale documentation. But I think also one thing is when we're writing documentation or creating it or recording the videos, it's normally because it's something we've been doing for a long time already, and we're repeating that process over and over and again. So I don't think it necessarily goes stale. I think it's more just making sure it's keeping it up to date. Would you agree, V?
Yeah, and I can't see documentation being a full-time role within MOPS or RevOps, but I do see documentation being a responsibility or a function of someone. So making sure that someone knows it's their responsibility to do this and to keep it up to date, and that they've got the time to do that. I mean, carving that time out is always the hardest part about documentation generally. But if you've got some roles and responsibilities in your team, that means that person is actually responsible for that. It's going to make that a little easier. But making time to do documentation could be a whole other 45-minute presentation.
Yeah. Yeah, I've got 2 people in my team who are kind of, one of their roles is the documentation. So we have an Asana project set up with the documentation, all the things that we want to document. And then they don't necessarily have due dates, but when they find time, if it's a quiet Friday afternoon, which we know doesn't always happen, but when they do miraculously happen, they'll pop into Asana and go and see, like, is there anything we're missing? Do we need to update anything? And then actually it's the responsibility of everyone in the team of, if we have a document that's already created and we change a process or we change an SLA or we add something into a template, that everyone knows we have to go in and make sure we update that documentation where we can.
Oh, and Amy, I hope you saw the link to the DocuBot. I put it in the chat after your question, after you asked that.
Awesome.
I think we're probably out of time.
Yeah, I think we were spending most of our time answering the questions. I'm just having a quick scroll. We've got Danielle's.
Somebody was asking about your Chrome plugin.
Oh, yeah. So the Chrome plugin, I think I asked it, but the Chrome plugin is Awesome Screenshot. It's just a little Chrome plugin. You can edit videos in there. You can do recordings. You can record a tab, a whole browser, a whole page. I really like it. It's simple to use. I know that Loom was mentioned as well, and I think we've seen Tango.io was another tool that was mentioned as well. There are tons of tools. There are tons of ways in which we can do documentation. Again, it's not just about writing War and Peace and writing a 700-page document. People aren't going to read that. It's about making something that's interesting, different, and you are addressing all of the different ways in which we learn. But yeah, I think that's everything.
Thanks very much, everybody. We really appreciate you hanging out to the end of the day and or the end of the morning if you're dialing in from ANZ, and we'll see you at the Mopsies.